Nothing illustrates the perverse logic of our modern administrative state quite like observing a young mother of 3 explaining to me why she cannot possibly work. Not cannot in any physical sense, she's perfectly healthy, but cannot because the system has arranged itself so cunningly that employment would represent financial suicide. This conversation, repeated countless times in my consulting room, reveals a truth so uncomfortable that polite society refuses to acknowledge it. Our welfare system has become a machine for manufacturing the very dependency it claims to cure. After decades of treating patients trapped within this bureaucratic labyrinth, I've witnessed firsthand how policies designed with the noblest intentions produce results so systematically cruel that no malicious dictator could have devised them more effectively. The welfare state, that supposed triumph of compassionate governance, has become perhaps the most efficient destroyer of human agency ever conceived. What makes this destruction particularly insidious is its complete invisibility to those who designed it. The comfortable classes who advocate for ever-expanding benefits never experience their consequences. They live in a parallel universe where work provides meaning, marriage offers stability, and education opens doors. Meanwhile, they've created a system that actively punishes these very behaviors among those they claim to help. Today, I want to share what 30 years of clinical observation has taught me about this elegant machine of human degradation. Chapter 1: The Clinical Evidence, Dependency as Pathology. In my years working in inner-city hospitals and prisons, I've encountered thousands of individuals whose lives have been systematically destroyed by well-meaning social policies. The pattern is so consistent it could be taught in medical schools as a syndrome, welfare dependency complex, characterized by learned helplessness, chronic resentment, and the complete atrophy of personal agency. Consider Sarah, a 24-year-old woman I treated for depression. 3 children by different fathers. None present. No education beyond 15, no work experience, no aspirations beyond her next benefit payment. But here's what struck me most. When I suggested she might find purpose and self-respect through employment, she looked at me as if I'd proposed she fly to the moon. The welfare system hadn't simply supported her during temporary difficulty, it had systematically dismantled her capacity to imagine any other existence. This psychological destruction follows a predictable pattern. First comes dependency. The individual learns that survival requires navigating bureaucratic systems rather than developing productive skills. Then comes rationalization. Elaborate explanations emerge for why work is impossible, education unnecessary, and personal responsibility an outdated concept. Finally comes resentment. The beneficiary develops deep hostility toward the very society that supports them, feeling simultaneously entitled to benefits and bitter about their circumstances. What makes this pathology particularly tragic is how it masquerades as compassion. Social workers speak earnestly about supporting families and meeting basic needs, never acknowledging they're actually administering a slow-acting poison that destroys the human spirit's natural resilience. They've created a parallel economy where the currency isn't productivity but victimhood, where success is measured not by what you contribute but by how effectively you can demonstrate your neediness. The medical evidence is overwhelming. Long-term welfare recipients exhibit higher rates of depression, anxiety, domestic violence, and substance abuse than comparable populations facing temporary hardship without state intervention. Yet this evidence is systematically ignored by a professional class whose careers depend on perpetuating the very problems they claim to solve. They've created what economists call a moral hazard, a system that rewards precisely the behaviors that guarantee continued dependence. Most disturbing is how this pathology transmits across generations. Children raised in welfare-dependent households don't simply inherit poverty, they inherit a complete worldview that positions them as permanent victims entitled to support but incapable of self-sufficiency. They learn that pregnancy brings increased benefits, that education is for other people, And that legitimate work is for suckers who haven't figured out how to game the system. Chapter 2: The Cultural Destruction: How Dependency Corrupts Values. The welfare state's most insidious achievement isn't merely creating individual dependency, it's systematically corrupting the cultural values that make civilization possible. In communities where welfare has become the dominant economic force, I've observed the complete inversion of traditional moral categories. Work, once considered virtuous, becomes viewed as stupidity. Why labor for wages when the state provides income without effort? Marriage, traditionally seen as the foundation of stable family life, becomes an economic liability. Why marry when benefits decrease for coupled households? Education, once the pathway to advancement, becomes irrelevant when advancement itself is neither expected nor rewarded. This value inversion doesn't happen overnight. It emerges gradually as rational individuals adapt to perverse incentives. A young woman discovers she receives more money unmarried with children than married and employed. A young man learns that legitimate work pays less than the combination of benefits, black market income, and petty crime. These aren't moral failures, they're logical responses to a system that rewards dependency and punishes initiative. What emerges is an entirely alternative culture with its own status markers and achievement measures. Instead of celebrating educational accomplishment, the community celebrates skill at manipulating bureaucracy. Instead of honoring productive work, it honors cunning in avoiding work. Instead of respecting stable families, it normalizes chaos as an inevitable fact of life. This cultural corruption extends far beyond economic behavior. Language itself becomes corrupted as euphemisms multiply to obscure uncomfortable realities. Teenage pregnancy becomes young parenthood. Chronic unemployment becomes structural disadvantage. Criminal behavior becomes antisocial coping strategies. This linguistic fog prevents honest assessment of problems, making effective solutions impossible. Perhaps most damaging is how welfare dependency corrupts the relationship between effort and reward. In healthy cultures, children learn that good outcomes require personal effort and responsible choices. In welfare-dependent communities, children observe that benefits flow regardless of behavior, creating a worldview where personal agency becomes meaningless. The psychological impact is devastating. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures who derive self-worth from contributing to something larger than themselves. Welfare dependency systematically strips away this source of meaning, replacing it with the hollow satisfaction of successfully navigating bureaucratic requirements. The result is what I've seen countless times: individuals who are materially provided for but spiritually dead, sustained by a system that meets their physical needs while destroying their souls. This cultural destruction creates a self-perpetuating cycle. Communities lose the social capital necessary for economic development. Businesses avoid areas where workforce reliability is poor. Schools decline as education becomes devalued. Crime increases as legitimate opportunities disappear and alternative value systems emerge. The tragedy is that this destruction is entirely preventable. Human beings naturally gravitate toward productive activity when the incentive structure rewards it. But welfare systems consistently reward the opposite, creating artificial scarcity of the very behaviors that could restore community health. Chapter 3: The Logic of Perverse Incentives: Why Good Intentions Produce Bad Outcomes. The welfare state's fundamental flaw isn't poor administration or insufficient funding. It's the iron law of unintended consequences applied to human behavior. Every benefit designed to help people in difficulty creates incentives that encourage the very behaviors that perpetuate difficulty. This isn't theory, it's empirical observation confirmed by decades of clinical experience. Take housing assistance, ostensibly designed to prevent homelessness. In practice, it creates powerful incentives for family breakdown. A single mother with children receives priority for housing assistance, a stable two-parent family faces years-long waiting lists. The system literally rewards the dissolution of intact families while penalizing stability. I've seen countless women admit they avoid marriage because it would cost them their housing benefits, a rational calculation that destroys the foundation of civilized society. Consider the complexity of managing multiple benefit streams. A skilled welfare recipient must navigate housing assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, cash benefits, childcare assistance, utility subsidies, and education grants. This requires considerable intelligence and energy, precisely the qualities that would ensure success in legitimate employment. But the system channels these capabilities toward dependency management rather than productive activity. The mathematics of the welfare cliff make the perversity explicit. A woman earning nothing might receive benefits worth $30,000 annually. Employment at $20,000 represents a significant financial loss. Even employment at $35,000 often nets less income after taxes and lost benefits. The system thus creates a rational economic argument against self-improvement, a catastrophic inversion of natural incentives. What's particularly maddening is how advocates respond to evidence of these perverse effects. Rather than acknowledging systematic problems, they demand more funding, expanded benefits, and reduced requirements. When dependency increases, they claim insufficient support. When behavior deteriorates, they blame external factors. When families dissolve, they celebrate alternative family structures. The possibility that the intervention itself causes the problems becomes literally unthinkable. This intellectual blindness isn't accidental, it's structurally necessary. Thousands of professionals build careers administering welfare systems. Universities train social workers, policy analysts, and community organizers whose livelihoods depend on perpetuating the problems they ostensibly address. A successful solution that eliminated dependency would eliminate their employment. The system thus creates powerful constituencies for its own expansion regardless of effectiveness. The psychological damage extends beyond recipients to administrators themselves. Social workers enter their profession believing they'll help people achieve independence and dignity. Instead, they become functionaries in a system that systematically undermines both. This cognitive dissonance requires elaborate rationalization. Problems must be externalized, blame shifted to society or systemic inequities, rather than acknowledging the destructive role of intervention itself. Meanwhile, honest feedback becomes impossible. Recipients who voice criticism risk losing benefits. Administrators who question effectiveness risk their careers. Politicians who propose reforms face accusations of cruelty. The system thus becomes immune to correction, perpetually expanding while producing ever worse outcomes for those it claims to serve. The ultimate irony is that genuine emergency assistance, temporary help during genuine crises, actually works quite well. Humans facing sudden unemployment, medical emergencies, or natural disasters benefit enormously from short-term support that allows them to regain their footing. But the welfare state has transformed emergency assistance into permanent lifestyle maintenance, destroying its effectiveness while exponentially multiplying its costs and social damage. Chapter 4: The Sentimentalism of Elites, How Compassion Becomes Cruelty. Nothing exposes the moral bankruptcy of our welfare system quite like observing the stark difference between how its advocates live and how their policies force others to live. The comfortable classes who design and defend welfare programs inhabit a world where personal responsibility, delayed gratification, and stable family structures remain the unquestioned foundations of success. Yet they create systems that systematically undermine these very principles for the poor. This isn't hypocrisy in the conventional sense, it's something far more insidious. These advocates genuinely believe they're demonstrating superior compassion by supporting policies they would never accept for their own families. A social worker earning $70,000 annually will passionately defend a system that traps families in $15,000 benefit packages, never recognizing the breathtaking condescension implicit in this position. The psychology underlying this sentimentalism is complex but revealing. Middle-class professionals derive enormous psychological satisfaction from supporting welfare programs because it allows them to feel morally superior without requiring any personal sacrifice. They can advocate for increased benefits while living in neighborhoods insulated from the consequences. They can celebrate alternative family structures while ensuring their own children grow up in stable two-parent households. This sentimental compassion becomes particularly cruel because it denies the poor the very thing they most need: honest feedback about behavior and consequences. When a middle-class teenager becomes pregnant, she faces immediate family pressure to delay parenthood until she can provide stability for a child. When a poor teenager becomes pregnant, social workers celebrate her choice and immediately begin arranging benefits that will perpetuate her dependence. The language of welfare advocacy reveals this patronizing cruelty. Poor people are described as vulnerable populations who cannot be expected to respond rationally to incentives. They're portrayed as passive victims of circumstances entirely beyond their control. This dehumanizing narrative serves the psychological needs of advocates while destroying the dignity of those it claims to help. I've observed this dynamic countless times in case conferences. Middle-class professionals gather to discuss clients with a combination of pity and condescension that would be immediately recognizable as racism if applied to ethnic differences. The assumption throughout is that poor people lack the agency, intelligence, or moral capacity to improve their circumstances through personal effort. The solution is always more intervention, more services, more professional management of lives deemed too chaotic for self-direction. The ultimate expression of this sentimental cruelty is the systematic lowering of expectations. Schools reduce academic standards rather than demanding excellence. Social workers accept criminal behavior as inevitable rather than insisting on lawful conduct. Healthcare providers treat addiction as a medical condition requiring maintenance rather than a behavioral problem requiring change. This expectation lowering creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. When society signals that it expects nothing from certain groups, those groups often deliver exactly what's expected. The soft bigotry of low expectations becomes indistinguishable from genuine bigotry in its practical effects, creating permanent underclasses trapped in cycles of dependency and dysfunction. What makes this particularly tragic is that the poor are perfectly capable of responding to appropriate incentives and expectations. In my clinical practice, I've seen remarkable transformations when individuals encounter systems that demand rather than excuse, that expect rather than enable. But such encounters become increasingly rare as welfare systems expand their reach and multiply their excuses. The advocates, meanwhile, remain blissfully insulated from the consequences of their compassion. They live in safe neighborhoods, send their children to good schools, and build careers on the perpetuation of problems they never personally experience. Their sentimentalism costs them nothing while destroying the lives of those they claim to help, a perfect example of how privileged compassion becomes systematic cruelty. Chapter 5: The Corruption of Language: How Euphemisms Conceal Catastrophe. In my decades observing welfare systems, I've become fascinated by the elaborate linguistic apparatus constructed to obscure their failures. This isn't merely political correctness. It's a sophisticated form of reality denial that prevents honest assessment of catastrophic social policies. The corruption of language serves as both symptom and cause of welfare dependency's perpetuation. Consider how we discuss the most basic welfare behaviors. Teenage pregnancy becomes early parenthood or young families. The euphemism eliminates moral judgment while obscuring the devastating economic and social consequences for both mother and child. Chronic unemployment transforms into job seeking or workforce development, Language that implies active effort rather than passive dependency. Criminal behavior becomes involvement with the justice system, as if lawbreaking were equivalent to jury service. This linguistic manipulation serves multiple functions. First, it allows advocates to discuss welfare issues without confronting uncomfortable realities. Second, it prevents recipients from developing accurate assessments of their own behavior. Third, it shields middle-class professionals from acknowledging their role in perpetuating destructive patterns. The most insidious example is how poverty itself has been redefined. Traditional poverty meant lack of basic necessities: food, shelter, clothing. Modern welfare recipients typically have adequate housing, sufficient food, healthcare coverage, and numerous consumer goods their grandparents would have considered luxuries. Yet they're still classified as impoverished because their income falls below arbitrary statistical measures. This redefinition serves to perpetuate welfare systems regardless of their effectiveness. No matter how much material improvement occurs, statistical poverty persists because it's defined relatively rather than absolutely. The goalposts continuously shift, ensuring permanent employment for poverty professionals while obscuring genuine progress. Language corruption extends to how we discuss welfare reform. Any attempt to reduce benefits becomes taking food from children's mouths. Requirements for work or education become punishing the poor. Time limits become abandoning vulnerable families. The rhetoric systematically frames accountability as cruelty while portraying enablement as compassion. Particularly revealing is how we discuss welfare recipients themselves. They're invariably described as clients, consumers, or service users, language borrowed from voluntary commercial relationships. This terminology obscures the coercive nature of welfare systems and the dependency they create. Recipients don't choose poverty services the way customers choose restaurants. They're trapped in bureaucratic systems that control their lives while claiming to serve their needs. Professional welfare advocates have developed an entire vocabulary designed to eliminate personal responsibility from any discussion of social problems. Disadvantaged replaces poor. At risk replaces dangerous. Challenged replaces failing. Alternative lifestyles replace destructive behaviors. Each euphemism serves to obscure agency while expanding the scope of professional intervention. The ultimate linguistic corruption involves how we discuss welfare outcomes. Programs never fail, they're simply underfunded. Policies never create perverse incentives, they encounter implementation challenges. Recipients never make destructive choices, they respond to structural inequities. This language makes honest evaluation impossible while ensuring endless expansion of failed interventions. What's particularly maddening is how this linguistic fog prevents learning from success. Communities that have reduced dependency through demanding accountability are accused of blaming victims. Programs that achieve genuine improvements by raising expectations are criticized for cultural insensitivity. The language systematically delegitimizes effectiveness while celebrating dysfunction. This corruption of language ultimately serves the interests of welfare bureaucracies rather than their supposed beneficiaries. It allows professionals to avoid confronting the destructive consequences of their interventions while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. Meanwhile, the people trapped in welfare dependency are denied the honest feedback necessary for genuine improvement. Chapter 6: The Destruction of Character: How Welfare Undermines Human Flourishing. Perhaps welfare's most devastating impact is its systematic destruction of character, those habits of thought and behavior that enable human flourishing. After treating thousands of welfare recipients, I've observed how prolonged dependency doesn't simply provide material support, it fundamentally alters personality in ways that make eventual independence virtually impossible. Character develops through the daily experience of connecting effort to outcome. Children learn self-discipline by observing that homework improves grades, that practice improves performance, That saving enables purchases. Adults maintain character through work that demands punctuality, reliability, and cooperation. Welfare systems sever these connections, creating alternative realities where outcomes depend on bureaucratic manipulation rather than personal effort. The transformation I've witnessed follows predictable stages. Initially, recipients maintain shame about their dependency and actively seek alternatives. This healthy response gets systematically undermined by welfare professionals who reframe dependency as a right and shame as internalized oppression. Recipients learn to view their benefits not as temporary assistance but as permanent entitlements earned through their victim status. This reframing process is psychologically devastating because it requires recipients to embrace helplessness as a core aspect of identity. To maintain benefits, they must continuously demonstrate incapacity, dysfunction, and need. The system literally rewards the absence of positive qualities while punishing their development. Self-respect becomes a liability, competence threatens benefit eligibility. The impact on time orientation is particularly destructive. Healthy character development requires delayed gratification, sacrificing immediate pleasures for long-term benefits. Welfare systems reverse this orientation by providing immediate relief while offering no long-term advantages for responsible behavior. Recipients learn to think only in terms of immediate needs and monthly benefit cycles, losing the capacity for long-term planning that enables genuine progress. Family relationships suffer enormously as welfare systems pit individual interests against collective well-being. Benefits often decrease when families remain intact, creating financial incentives for relationship dissolution. Children learn that adults' romantic relationships are temporary economic arrangements rather than stable foundations for child-rearing. The concept of mutual obligation, central to healthy family functioning, withers when the state assumes responsibility for basic provision. Work-related character traits atrophy rapidly in welfare environments. Punctuality becomes irrelevant when benefit appointments are the only scheduled commitments. Reliability becomes unnecessary when survival doesn't depend on meeting others' expectations. Cooperation becomes counterproductive when benefits depend on individual rather than collective achievement. Most tragically, welfare dependency destroys the natural human tendency toward self-improvement. Recipients discover that education, skill development, and personal growth can threaten benefit eligibility. The system thus creates powerful disincentives for the very behaviors that could enable independence. I've seen intelligent individuals deliberately avoid opportunities for advancement because success would cost them their benefits. The psychological literature on learned helplessness perfectly describes welfare's impact on human agency. When individuals repeatedly experience outcomes independent of their efforts, they gradually stop trying to influence their circumstances. This learned helplessness becomes so deeply ingrained that even when genuine opportunities arise, recipients cannot recognize or pursue them. Welfare systems also corrupt the natural human instinct for reciprocity. Healthy relationships involve mutual exchange of benefits. Welfare provides one-way transfer with no expectation of contribution. Recipients learn to view themselves as entitled to receive without obligation to give, fundamentally distorting their understanding of social relationships. The moral imagination suffers particularly severe damage. Children raised in welfare households don't simply inherit material poverty, they inherit impoverished models of human possibility. They observe adults whose primary life skill involves navigating bureaucracy, whose primary relationship is with social workers, whose primary identity involves their dysfunction. These children grow up believing such limitations are natural and inevitable rather than artificially created by destructive policies. Recovery from this character destruction is possible but extraordinarily difficult. It requires not just material independence but psychological reconstruction of basic assumptions about effort, reward, and human agency. The longer individuals remain in welfare systems, the more profound this reconstruction challenge becomes. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Restoring Human Agency Through Accountability. After witnessing welfare's destructive impact for decades, I'm convinced that genuine reform requires abandoning our current approach entirely. Half measures and incremental changes cannot address problems created by the fundamental logic of dependency systems. We must restore the connection between effort and reward, between choice and consequence, between rights and responsibilities. The foundation of genuine reform is time-limited assistance with mandatory work requirements. Emergency help during genuine crises can be enormously beneficial, but only when recipients understand that assistance is temporary and conditional on efforts toward independence. Current systems that provide indefinite support without meaningful requirements create permanent dependency rather than temporary relief. Work requirements must be genuine, not make-work programs that simulate employment while providing no real skills or expectations. Recipients capable of work should be required to accept available employment, regardless of their preferences about wages or working conditions. The goal isn't to provide ideal jobs but to reconnect individuals with the basic experience of earning through effort. Education and training programs must focus on practical skills that lead to immediate employment rather than academic credentials that may never be used. Community colleges offering automotive repair, healthcare assistance, and skilled trades provide far better pathways to independence than university programs that saddle recipients with debt while offering few employment prospects. Child care assistance should support working parents while refusing to subsidize non-working recipients. The current system that provides free childcare to unemployed mothers while requiring working parents to pay full costs creates perverse incentives against employment. Reformed systems should make childcare support contingent on work or education participation. Housing policy requires complete overhaul to eliminate incentives for family breakdown. Priority for housing assistance should go to stable two-parent families rather than single mothers. Current policies that reward family dissolution while penalizing marriage represent systematic attacks on the foundation of civilized society. Most crucially, we must restore expectations and eliminate excuses. Social workers should be trained to demand accountability rather than enable dysfunction. Benefits should be contingent on behavior modification rather than simple need demonstration. Recipients should face real consequences for poor choices rather than automatic support regardless of conduct. This transformation requires confronting the professional classes whose careers depend on perpetuating welfare dependency. Universities that train social workers in enabling philosophies must be challenged. Agencies that profit from managing rather than solving poverty must face accountability for their outcomes. Politicians who purchase votes through expanded benefits must be exposed for the damage they cause. Local communities must reclaim responsibility for helping their own members rather than delegating this function to distant bureaucracies. Churches, civic organizations, and neighborhood groups understand local needs and can provide assistance tied to genuine accountability. They can also offer the personal relationships and community support that enable lasting change. Private charity, operating through voluntary associations, provides far superior assistance to government welfare. Private charities can discriminate between deserving and undeserving cases, can demand behavioral change, and can withdraw support from those who abuse assistance. They also create genuine relationships between givers and receivers rather than bureaucratic entitlements. The transition away from welfare dependency must be gradual but inexorable. Current recipients should receive advance notice that benefits will be time-limited and tied to specific behavioral requirements. New applicants should face strict work requirements from the beginning. The goal is to restore normal incentive structures that reward productive behavior while refusing to subsidize dysfunction. Success in this transformation requires moral clarity about human nature and social responsibility. Humans thrive when faced with appropriate challenges and expectations. They deteriorate when enabled in destructive behaviors. True compassion demands accountability. False compassion enables suffering. The welfare state represents false compassion elevated to social policy, a systematic cruelty disguised as kindness. The alternative is continued expansion of human degradation disguised as social progress. Each generation raised in welfare dependency becomes less capable of independence, more accepting of dysfunction, and more hostile to the values that make civilization possible. Conclusion. The welfare state stands as perhaps the most successful destroyer of human potential ever devised by well-meaning people. Under the banner of compassion, it has systematically severed the connections between effort and reward, choice and consequence, rights and responsibilities that make human flourishing possible. The result is not the elimination of poverty but its perpetuation across generations, not the strengthening of families but their systematic dissolution, not the enhancement of human dignity but its methodical destruction. What makes this catastrophe particularly tragic is its complete preventability. The human spirit naturally gravitates toward productivity, responsibility, and self-improvement when faced with appropriate incentives. But welfare systems consistently reward the opposite, creating artificial scarcity of the very behaviors that could restore individual and community health. The path forward requires abandoning comfortable illusions about human nature and social policy. We must acknowledge that genuine compassion sometimes requires allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. We must recognize that enabling destructive behavior, however well-intentioned, ultimately serves the psychological needs of the enablers rather than the genuine interests of those enabled. The choice before us is stark: continue expanding systems that systematically degrade human potential while enriching their administrators, or restore the accountability and expectations that allow individuals and communities to flourish. The welfare state represents the institutionalization of low expectations, a comprehensive insult to human dignity disguised as social progress. True reform begins with the recognition that our current approach isn't insufficiently funded or poorly implemented, it's fundamentally misconceived and inevitably destructive.